Western civilization is at risk, and America, being the end result of the application of the principles embodied by Western civilization, is equally at risk. And I think that the risk does not just come from some temporal political event that's happening somewhere out there. The risk comes from some of the ideals that the West and many nations in the West have embodied over the course of the past few decades, namely the false category of human rights and the vile notion of multiculturalism. And in this video, we're going to actually explore how these two ideas have cooperated in unison to make a mockery of the West, to make a mockery of Western peoples. And we're going to explain how exactly to critique and beat these ideas in the battlefield of ideas and assert actual virtuous notions of citizenship, of rights, and other concepts that are essential to the maintenance of Western civil societies. Before we get into all that, my friends, hello, hello, hello. I am Christian Watson. I am your host. If you enjoy political and social commentary with a philosophical bent, then I must implore you, please, 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 like this video, comment on this video, share this video, subscribe to my channel, even if you disagree with me. Disagreement is how we refine the mind and how we see things outside of our own perspectives. And we enrich ourselves with more information than we had before we had known the information. So I would appreciate your support. Thank you so much. And now let us get on to the video. And so, as I mentioned in my intro, these two ideas, I think I have seen these two ideas pop up in some of the most disastrous ways over the past few decades in my study of over the past few decades. When we look at how the West is doing in terms of some of the recent events that have happened in places like France or the UK that have suffered from mass migration, and there have been complaints from the peoples of those countries of their cultures being whittled down in favor of other cultures. And when we look at some of the crises, some of the wars that have also broken out across the world that were justified upon the grounds of humanitarian interventions and correcting the human rights abuses of some of the people who the wars were allegedly launched to stop, like whether it be Gaddafi in Libya, whether it be most notably Saddam Hussein, I see behind these things two ideas that have just been the driving force of so much negativity, so much cultural erosion, and unfortunately so much destruction in the West. And so I'm going to treat this in order of importance. I'm going to start with addressing the idea of human rights, because the idea of human rights is actually right behind the idea of multiculturalism. In fact, multiculturalism wouldn't have such a big effect upon the West as it stands right now if it were not justified by the notion of human rights. So let's first address this. So many of you have probably heard the term human rights used by many people, especially used by those on the progressive left. You may have heard, for example, the very oft-used catchphrase, trans rights are human rights. You may have heard the phrase abortion is a human rights. You may have heard so many different things that are calling cards for the activist left being invoked as human rights. And when you hear the term human rights in this context, it may elicit a few things. It may elicit some kind of emotion. Well, I want to be humane, and human rights sound humane to me. They sound correct to me. They sound righteous to me. So I may be more sympathetic towards those kinds of claims. They may also evoke confusion. Some people may say, well, what's the difference between a human right and a civil right, or a human right and any other kind of right? And I think these different evocations that this term causes is on purpose. Because the idea of human rights is actually one of the greatest lies of the 20th century. It's actually a very recent invention that parasitizes concepts of rights that came before it, but then repurposes it for the purposes of those who happen to be in power at that moment. In the case of human rights, the progressives who wanted to establish a sort of international system of government to erode the national sovereignty of the Western nations, and by doing so introduce their agendas within the borders in the name of benevolence. Now, in order for me to explain how this happened, I have to first explain or talk about the idea of rights and the origins of the ideas of rights. So let me ask all of you a question. What exactly are rights? Now, this is a rhetorical question, but it's an important question that I want you all to think about as you listen to this video. Well, a lot of people can't answer that question Some people may just say, well, rights are things that you use to demand things. Rights are things that you're entitled to. There are all kind of different answers. That if you were to go on the street in America and ask a college student these things, they may either have a blank stare, or they may just go ahead and say a bunch of things that they have a sensibility about. But most people don't actually understand, A, what rights are, and B, what they're meant to do for us in society. So I'll actually provide you guys what I think is a pretty compelling answer. You can disagree if you want, but this will provide grounding for my critique on the idea of human rights. Rights are simply qualities that you possess by virtue of you being a human being that are discoverable through your ability to think, your reason, that do a few things. Number one, they place demands on society. Number two, they place demands on the government. By demands, I mean limits. Number three, they place demands, and by demands, I mean limits, on your own action. And number four, they establish a social context in which you can use your free will to operate in a moral fashion. Rights are qualities we all have that enable us to live morally responsible lives. They are not given to us by a government. They are not given to us by material things. They are not given to us by a do-gooder. They are inherent to our being. All of us, by virtue of being a human being, has access to these rights. Now, what I just said was for a very long time, for the 18th century, was the dominant understanding of rights. It was the understanding that Thomas Jefferson and the founders largely had, the idea of natural rights, and it's that understanding that they used to craft American civil society. And I'll be more technical here, although it's not very important for me to go into techniques. This idea of rights was birthed in the Enlightenment era, but it has roots in the Stoics of Rome. It has roots in ancient Greece. It has roots in the Catholic understanding of rights. And a philosopher called Francisco Suarez, in the medieval period, right before we went to the Enlightenment period, actually innovated this idea of rights. And then a philosopher called Grotius took his innovation, applied it. Then John Locke and the American founders picked that up, and they used it to create America. So what I'm saying is not some esoteric thing. It's actually essential to what the DNA of America actually is. Well, for a very long time, this is the understanding of rights. It established a society where private property was the engine of that society. It was the most sacred thing in that society. It established a society where freedom was expected and skepticism of a government was necessary. It established a society where virtuous people could act virtuously without interference from some busybody manager. Well, in the 1930s, things began to change. In the 1930s, a document called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was enshrined into the DNA of the United Nations. And it became this global thing, this global guide on how nation states within the United Nations were supposed to direct their policies and also govern their countries. The birth of the United Nations coincides with the death of national sovereignty. And the death of national sovereignty coincides with the rise of multiculturalism, and the rise of multiculturalism coincides with the destruction of native cultures, and the destruction of native cultures coincides with the civil turmoil we are seeing across the West today, the lack of social cohesion we are seeing across the West today. I'll get into that more in a moment, but this is what you guys need to understand. Connect the dots. And so, by virtue of that, human rights was sort of the initiator of this process of decay, conflict, and destruction. So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights defined human rights not simply as things that belong to you as a human being. No. It defined rights as things that you are owed that come from without, that are not a part of your inherent nature as a human being. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights says that, for example, in Articles 12 to 17, that there is a right to nationality and a right to asylum. So if you are fleeing an oppressive government, you have the right to demand asylum in a foreign country, and they have to take you. That's what that means. And that's basically, by the way, that is the way that the United States asylum laws are structured, and that is why we've had a migration crisis. Because the laws basically say that there is a duty upon the United States government to care for a foreign population and their claims to asylum over the demands of the domestic population. Isn't that messed up? Isn't that incorrect? Now, even with that law, There was President Trump who managed to diminish the damage that could be done with that and lower the amount of crossings. But we now have Joe Biden that did the exact opposite and let millions of people in under the auspices of asylum claims without actually using his executive authority to push back against this. Ideas have consequences. Ideas have consequences. Let's go on. In Articles 18 to 21, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says that there is, of course, freedom of opinion, expression, yada, 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 so on and so forth, and receiving and imparting information and ideas through any media. Now, many of us would recognize these things as rights, but the fact that you have the United Nations saying that this is how they need to be administered in all these different countries is what's concerning. Then you go to Articles 22 to 27. This is where we see more of a different notion of rights than we're used to. It says, for example, that individuals have rights to health care. They have rights to an adequate standard of living and all other kind of things. So if you have a right to health care, what you really have is a right to someone else's services. Now, how can you have a right to what someone else has to produce with their own labor and their own free will and their own intellection? You really can't if you operate under the traditional idea of rights. But if you view rights as an ever-expansive thing, as a sort of positive thing, as it is so called, with the idea of positive rights, which human rights represent, then you have the right not only to be free or to be limited from someone else's harmful actions, but to demand things from them and to enforce that demand through political force. This is what ultimately human rights are. They are a counterfeit notion of rights, a false category of rights that confuses privileges with rights, makes a mockery out of the 18th century notion of rights that embodied the notion of human rights up until that point, and most importantly, set nations up to interference from outside bodies who had the ability to influence them, to disregard their own customs, their own cultures, and their own national self-interest in the name of this global idea of pursuing human rights. Now, beyond the erosion of national sovereignty, this idea also had the effect of justifying several wars. May I remind you that in the 1990s, Bill Clinton went into Serbia under the basis that human rights are being violated, even though not a single American was attacked, and not a single American had anything to do with that. He went into Serbia and had war there. George Bush went into Iraq, which is largely recognized as an absolute disaster, on the basis of human rights abuses. Now today, Iraq is an absolute hellhole. Barack Obama more recently went into Libya on the basis of Gaddafi being a human rights abuser, despite the fact that Gaddafi was funded by American dollars, because he was an asset for us in the region for a long time. But the moment he gets a little bit too big for his britches, we kill him in the name of human rights, and then we cause Libya to have some more human rights calamities by leaving it in a state of chaos because we just killed the stabilizer of that country, Gaddafi, so on and so forth. The interventions in Ukraine are being justified on the basis of human rights. The truth is this. When you have this expansive concept that has no limitations, that has no guardrails, that is based solely on demanding things from other people that you do not possess by virtue of you being a human being, you don't have a system of rights, you have a system of demands, of politically coerced demands that are enforced under the name of doing something good, but that actually have disastrous consequences. This leads me to multiculturalism. So multiculturalism has been the chief justification. Human rights was the mover of peoples, mover of different cultures into places in the West largely. And if we especially look at the past 10, 15 years, perhaps the past 10, 11, 12 years of the migration crises which in Europe that were created by American and NATO adventurism throughout the Middle East, the justifier of integrating those people was that their culture is still okay, or their culture should not be discriminated against just because they're different. And so multiculturalism began by embodying this sense of cultural relativism, that no culture is better than the other. But it also began to embody this other idea, that it is unfair to hold different cultures to the standard of the dominant culture. And that's ultimately the crux of multiculturalism, is that different cultures have no right to judge other cultures. And the dominant culture has no right to demand assimilation on the backs of cultures that are not the dominant culture. Now, if you have a system of human rights that puts different cultures into one area, and then a ideology of multiculturalism, which then influences those peoples to reject their own culture, to have a kind of okophobic, it's probably a new word for many of you, okophobic view of their own culture, and that just means a self-hating view of their own culture, not to be patriotic. What do you think the consequence is? The consequence is the erosion of the native culture and the elevation, crudely, the immoral elevation of the lower culture. So the problem with multiculturalism is not just that it has this kumbaya view of other cultures. It's not that it embraces cultural relativism, both of which are massive problems. The problem of multiculturalism is that it assumes all social situations and all social categories are not matters of assimilation, but that all social situations are matters of difference. Multiculturalism, simply put, defines people by their differences, not by what unites them. And it assumes that everything to do with society is defined by differences. So when you have a situation like this, social cohesion, which researchers recognize is the unifying principle of many cultures, is no longer possible. Because when extreme differences exist and there's no unifying set of values, people tend to conflict. Social categories, society itself presupposes that people within it will share a core set of values together. If you reject that premise, you have blown up the foundations of a peaceful civil society, of a cooperative society, and you have created the groundwork for a society much like what Hobbes describes in the Leviathan, where everyone is at war with each other and where everyone is a barbarian that needs state authority to correct them. What is happening right now in the UK? What's happening is the English were infantilized for decades by their government. Under this regime of human rights and multiculturalism, the native culture has been eroded, and now the government is coming in with a top-down authoritarian viewpoint. Look at what Keir Starmer did, announcing that he's going to monitor social media accounts that are disagreeing with certain things and he's going to be jailing people. They come in to enforce the multicultural order. Look at, for example, what happened when Trump announced the quote-unquote Muslim ban. People immediately began saying he was being cruel to people who were Muslim, but in all reality, he wasn't even talking about Muslims. He was talking about the possibility of people that have dangerous cultural values being in the United States, and he wants to ensure that all Americans, including Muslim Americans, were protected from those specific subset of people. But of course, you always misrepresent the premise in order to portray your ideological foe as a villain if you want to defeat your foe as opposed to actually confronting the substance of their arguments. It should also be noted that mass migration has also been justified by appeals to human rights. There was a piece in The Guardian some years back that basically said that all migrants should be taken into any country no matter what because they all have the freedom of movement. And therefore, if you obstruct them being able to come into a country through vetting process or anything, you are somehow violating their freedom of movement. Therefore, you are in violation of human rights. When a term or a category is so loosely created and it has no defining ethos beyond that which those in power want to make it mean, it can mean anything to anyone, anytime, and it can be used for purposes that are sinister but that are cloaked in the name of goodness. It should also be noted as well that Antony Blinken, the current Secretary of State of the United States of America, who has been obviously behind a lot of American interventions, whether it be in Ukraine or whatever, has explicitly said that his foreign policy is one based strictly on human rights. This is on the State Department website, and that United States needs to be a force to preserve human rights on the international stage. Again, these ideas have consequences, and they will oftentimes justify actions a priori that under any sane paradigm would not be justified, or they'd be heavily scrutinized, more scrutinized than they are under the paradigm of human rights. It is no secret to me, my friends, that what we are seeing happen across the West right now, the curse of the West, is happening because, most importantly, because of the elevation of human rights into all sectors of society, whether it be the endless wars done for human rights, whether it be the open borders of people just being able to come into many of the countries that exist in the West, human rights, this sort of diminishing of your own culture and your own people, human rights. It all goes together, and it's a curse. It's a curse because the problem is already bad when it begins, but it gets worse and worse as time progresses, because it is a fundamentally unsustainable way of sustaining a culture, of sustaining a people, and creating a good society. So what lessons do we have to learn here? Lessons we have to learn is that moral education is the most important thing that we in the West, especially us here in America, have to learn. And that a crisis of moral education underlies many of our own problems in this century. Not all cultures are equal. Some have better values than others. And we have to be willing to embrace that while also being pluralistic. Rights are not things that are given to you. They are things that enable you to be a moral person within the context of a society that has a dominant culture that if you're going to live in that society, you must conform to. These are basic truths that shouldn't be controversial, that are unfortunately controversial. And so long as these truths remain rejected, I don't think that the West has a very good outlook. And I don't think that America has a good outlook either. But if we begin to rediscover some basic things, reassert them, and live our lives as if they are true because they are, then I think we can right this ship and we can direct it towards the better direction that it should be. That is a direction of a strong culture, of a strong people, of a strong sense of moral duty and obligation and ethos that underlies a strong culture. And hopefully a place where people who wish to reap the fruits of that culture, not by changing them, but by conforming themselves to them, will be able to flourish. That is the society we should aspire to. But if we continue to reject, if Western cultures continue to reject their own culture, they lack patriotism, and they embrace these foreign ideas that were created for the simple purposes of top-down managing of societies, we may very well be seeing the decline of one of the greatest forces in human history, which is indeed Western civilization. I hope I'm wrong, but right now things do not look well. But this is all up to us. We can change it if we so wish. My friends, like, share, comment, subscribe. Do whatever you can to get our message out there. My friends, study history, study philosophy, remain morally convicted, and please stay pensive. Bye, guys.